Hi everyone, Worse Than Me Best Tano here, the internet's busiest music nerd. And it's time for another edition of our Worst to Best series, where I go over what albums I am ranking essentially from the worst to the best in a particular artist's discography. This time, it's Weezer, the legendary 90s alternative rock band. Yes, they have quite a lengthy discography, still adding to it. But I felt that now was a good time to maybe go over and reassess what exactly the highlights in the band's discography are up until this point. From the Blue Album to the Black Album, I will be going over every major studio release from Weezer. Here we go. For some people, it may seem kind of premature to put one of Weezer's latest records as the worst record in this list, but I don't think that's the case. I mean, for Weezer, it certainly could get worse from here, but in my cold, dead reviewer heart, I do firmly believe this album should be in this spot. I think this album perfectly exemplifies what Weezer fans are complaining about most of the time when it comes to the turn the band's music has taken over the years. Instead of sticking to their guns and embracing the sound and the ethos of the music that got them to where they are today, Weezer is completely content to embrace whatever awful cliche ideas are trending in the mainstream at whatever moment. And Pacific Daydream sees the band doing that essentially with the bright, shimmery, mostly synthetic sounds of millennial pop. What's worse is Rivers Cuomo's very strange and unique system of syllables and spreadsheets when it comes to songwriting. Yeah, it's led to quite a few really impersonal and formulaic songs that don't really have much substance to them. It's like I'm listening to random ideas cobbled together but tied up in a very nice bow, like on La Mancha Screwjob or on Get Right, which is a pretty exuberant and righteous rock song, but doesn't really feel like it's getting to the heart of anything. From the sunny atmospheres to the slick beats and the whoa whoa choruses, Weezer really has nothing to do on this album than play catch-up with the likes of Foster the People and Imagine Dragons. I will say there are some fans out there that I think are a little too dismissive when it comes to Rivers as he ages, wanting to write pop music for a pop audience. I mean, how many artists are in the mainstream and over the hill, but essentially still want to write songs for young audiences? Not that many. I mean, there's Pharrell. I guess what I'm trying to say is that in concept, I'm fine with it, but I don't think Rivers is particularly good at it, as it results in some sickeningly sweet cuts on this record, such as Feels Like Summer and Happy Hour. There are a couple of very admirable ballads in the track list here that feature some quality songwriting. The rich and triumphant Weekend Woman is great. Also, I love the very sad and acoustic QB Blitz. Rivers' songwriting, when it's good, it still shines even when he's dragging Weezer's sound through the dregs of mainstream pop trends that are going to go stale in 3 years. In hindsight, I do respect the band's attempts on this album at trying to create a true blue pop album that embraces modernity, that embraces California, that embraces the sound of a new generation. It is well-intentioned but ill-conceived. Weezer's 2005 album Make Believe is my next album in this list. It marks the band's first big collaboration with Rick Rubin, and even though at the time this record did chart higher than any Weezer album previously, in retrospect, by a lot of hardcore fans, it is seen as the group's real fall from grace. It's actually a miracle that the Weezer fanbase had any goodwill toward the band left within it after the release of this album. And that's not to say that Make Believe doesn't have its tolerable tracks, doesn't have its emotional moments like The Other Way, but the memory of this album is more defined by the plethora of radio-friendly pop-punk and alternative rock tunes that feature these obnoxious earworm choruses that just churn my stomach, like Beverly Hills or We Are All on Drugs. Tracks whose negative qualities actually contribute to them getting stuck in your head and not in a good way. But when Make Believe isn't being flat out irritating, it's just kind of going in one ear and out the other with some of the most soulless pop rock the band has ever recorded. The sound of this thing is squeaky clean, it's low impact, which is unfortunate given the band's knack for pop songwriting on Green and Blue, given how heavy and hard-hitting much of Maladroit was. Clearly, Weezer's continued bid for mainstream attention panned out on Make Believe financially, but in retrospect, it's easy to see why many look at Make Believe as one of the band's most stylistically bankrupt albums. Weezer's 2009 record RATITUDE, what many longtime fans consider to be their worst. Just the worst. And yeah, it's for good reason. It's hard to imagine a more effective way for Weezer to jettison their original fan base than to do a hip-hop crossover with Lil Wayne. The line, "Okay bitches, it's Weezer and Wheezy," suggests that the creative thrust behind the track isn't that much different than those nerdy t-shirts that mash together two pieces of pop culture because they can be punned. And given the track is called Can't Stop Partying, you would think the band would at least have the decency to bring on Andrew WK, but no. All that being said, though, RATITUDE does climb up a bit higher on the list here because I do see it as a somewhat riskier stab at pop songwriting than its predecessor Make Believe was. It also reflected a pretty extensive batch of collaborators, and up to this point Weezer had been a pretty insular act. So in a way I do kind of admire the commitment and sheer audacity that Weezer and Rivers showed on this record. The opening track and lead single from this record is kind of cute though, and for the most part what RATITUDE lacks is execution. And even if Rivers' approach to mainstream pop on this record is a little tongue-in-cheek, which it might be, the lyrics are still far too dumbed down and annoying. It's really a no-brainer that this album would end up so far down the list. Weezer's latest record at the recording of this video, their 2019 album Black, and it's essentially one of the biggest whatevers the group has ever recorded, point blank, period. Certainly not the worst album they've ever put out, but a totally forgettable mixed bag that really has no defining characteristics about it whatsoever, despite the kind of bold direction the band took on the cover art here. I was excited for this album originally, especially given teasers like Can't Knock the Hustle, which felt like a nice 90s throwback to a hodgepodge of rock and pop and hip-hop, packaged into a really sharp song that reflects Weezer's creative trajectory over the years. But despite a promising first half, this album essentially just turns into Make Believe Part 2, with the band dishing out another helping of the most soulless pop rock imaginable, tracked so cleanly that the instrumentals on this thing just sound like Muzak from feel-good beer commercials. Not to mention some of the band's worst songs ever turn up on this record too, like The Prince Who Wanted Everything, whose lyrics I really just can't stand. Also, the band's totally out of left field attempt at writing like some island pop on a Byzantine. This thing is mostly just a forgettable dud from a band who really could be taking more risks at this point in their career. At least when they were doing things like this on Make Believe, there was like an audience and a radio market for exactly this. At this point, what or who an album like Black serves, I'm just not sure. The next album in my list here also came out in 2019. It is Weezer's fifth self-titled album, the TEAL one. I would say this point in the Weezer worst to best is where the albums start getting tolerable. In fact, I would say most of the tracks on this album are pretty enjoyable, despite this album not containing any original songs, and not a whole lot of creative liberties outside of filtering these tracks through their usual Weezer sound. That kind of heavy, chunky, nerdy, power pop inspired alternative rock sound. There are some tracks on this thing where the band lays on the attitude or the fun really thick, like on their stadium-sized version of Happy Together or their take on TLC's No Scrubs. But for the most part, Weezer's takes on these tracks are kind of unimaginative. Still though, even that works out most of the time because their performances and the recordings on these tracks are pretty great, especially on their version of Africa, especially on their version of Take On Me. And I guess I do appreciate the band's attempt at drifting away from some of the more obvious rock choices that I think a lot of bands would have made if they were doing a cover album themselves, as Weezer's choices tend to focus more around synth pop and pop in general. On most of the tracks here, Rivers delivers some quality vocal performances, but the quality of those and this album in general does tend to falter in the second half, like his attempt at singing Michael Jackson's Billie Jean is laughable, to put it nicely. Nor is Brian Bell's attempt at singing an old school Black Sabbath song that great either. Also, the instrumental progression of the band's attempt at playing the song Stand By Me is utter trash, as they have no appreciation whatsoever for the instrumental subtlety of that song. This thing is sweet, it's listenable. If you're a hardcore fan, you most likely should give it at least a try. And honestly, it's just funny that this covers album beats out, quality-wise, a good chunk of Weezer's discography. Next, in our worst to best, we have Weezer's 2008 record, Red, which is widely written off by many fans of the band or ignored, maybe because it's coming out of an era where Weezer wasn't at their best. No matter the quality, every album Weezer does these days does seem to suffer from some kind of original sin that I guess they haven't quite answered for yet. But as someone who just enjoys the band's knack for nerdy earworm pop rock, Red does deliver some decent tracks. It's a flawed album for sure, but it's certainly not Weezer trying to be something that they're not, and the sound of this album wasn't totally lacking in bite like Make Believe was. Still, there are more moments on this thing that make me go yikes than I would like the band's decision to have Brian Bell write and sing a song on here, the track Thought I Knew, which is easily one of the worst tracks Weezer has ever recorded. It sounds like an awful, boring, run-of-the-mill 90s alternative rock single that would have been dead on arrival at the desk of any radio programmer at the time. Then the band goes full Beatles and lets the drummer sing one. Yes, Patrick Wilson has his own track on here. The track Automatic, which is kind of a hard rockin' but still completely substanceless pop rock tune with a horrifically awkward chorus. Hey, it's automatic! Lyrically, Rivers also runs a masterclass on cringe on the track Cold Dark World. But I see the girl that you are deep inside. Won't you allow me to give you a ride? I can console you and give you a kiss. Show you that you can do better than this. I wish I was making these lyrics up, but I'm not. The band continues to lay on the melodrama on the track The Angel and the One, but this song, as well as Dreamin', see the band overextending the length of their tracks past the point to where they're even entertaining. Now, I could see why some fans recoiled at the sound of tracks like, everybody get dangerous, everybody get dangerous. But if Weezer taking themselves seriously isn't a requirement for you to enjoy a Weezer song, then you should have no problem getting into this track. I also have heavy respect on this record for the track The Greatest Man Who Ever Lived. With its multiple musical and instrumental changes, it's one of the most ambitious things the band has ever recorded. It's kind of like their Happiness Is a Warm Gun. The opening track on this thing is really good. Heart Songs is easily one of the band's best ballads. And honestly, Pork and Beans will forever remain one of my favorite Weezer singles, period. And not just because of its incredible riffs and its thick production and its really sharp songwriting. And I do like the ethos of the track stating the band's creative freedom and that they're going to do what they want to do, taking a shot at haters and critics who are trying to push the band into being the group they want them to be when that's just not going to happen. And yes, that is a theme, that is an idea that the band has touched down on in song many, many, many times at this point, but Pork and Beans is maybe one of my favorite examples of it, I guess. Certainly not the worst album in their discography, obviously, in my opinion, but a record still where I think I appreciate what they're trying to do more than what they actually did. And Red does feature some of the best musical highlights from Weezer of this decade, as well as some excruciating tracks as well. That's why it's falling kind of in the middle of this list. Honestly, despite its dumb cover, silly name, and extremely flaccid promotional rollout, HURLEY is a pretty good album for Weezer. I liked it upon release, and in retrospect, I see this album as being a part of a miniature streak where the band was kind of getting the ball rolling once again on putting out less sucky albums. Kind of a miniature return to form from here to the White Album. And this thing is just a bunch of no-frills pop rock songs that see the band just kind of getting back to basics while also inviting on a lot of guest songwriters. People who have a track record for making hits, individuals like Mac Davis and Linda Perry. And I would say this album is the first instance where Weezer inviting on these other songwriters to help make the record really paid off. The quality really showed in how good the tunes were. You have the exuberant and celebratory Memories, which is an amazing opener. Memories make me wanna go back there. Back there. The amazing song Ruling Me, which is this track about being essentially a slave to desire and lust. The driving guitars, the harmonious background vocals, and the undeniable chorus on this thing are great. You also have the dysfunctional and heart-wrenching train wrecks. Even Rivers' only solo songwriting outing on this thing, Unspoken, is incredible. It feels like a youthful, raw, acoustic throwback to the days of Pinkerton in a way. If only this track could have been recorded in a more lo-fi fashion, it would have fit right in on on that album. Yes, there is nothing truly new or exciting for Weezer on this record, but when it comes to Weezer putting out an album that isn't total trash, that's excitement enough for me. With one catchy and rockin' and passionate and well-produced track after another on this record, I can't not walk away from HURLEY pleased. There are a few goofy moments in the track list, like Smart Girls, as well as Where's My Sex, which sounds like a weird, warped, demented take on 90s grunge. But honestly, even though these tracks aren't my favorites, they do add to the personality of the album and do prevent it from being totally one-dimensional. Unfortunately, I think HURLEY will continue to be looked at as more of a footnote in the band's discography than an admirable moment, but this will forever remain one of the group's more solid records in my opinion, and will also serve as a reminder that album covers matter. Please pick a good album cover. You know, like, try. Just try. The next installment in our worst to best is Weezer's 2001 record Green, which came after a pretty long stint of studio album silence after their 96 record Pinkerton. Like their first LP, it was produced by the Cars' Rick Ocasek, and it was clocking in at just over 28 minutes. Yes, back in 2001, Weezer was already on that short album wave. This thing was also Weezer's most poppy and polished record at the time too. Obviously, the Blue album had its share of big singles, but Green, with one track after the next, you can tell the band was really trying to deliver here a lot of very throttling and catchy pop punk and alt rock. Just go really simple and meat and potatoes with it. Don't get too tied up into difficult emotions and sadness like they were on Pinkerton. Much of the songwriting on this thing is rooted in a pretty bold, catchy vocal melody or a crunchy guitar riff, like on maybe the biggest single from this thing, Hash Pipe. And the band's more impersonal approach to songwriting and lyricism did seem to pay off, as Green did kind of kill it on the charts. Of course, the popularity of this album was bolstered by Weezer returning with some huge singles like Island in the Sun and Hash Pipe that I mentioned earlier, which, believe it or not, is actually one of my least favorite Weezer songs. To this day, I just think the lyrics of that track are so dumb. But overall on this album, the band did do a decent job of streamlining and simplifying their sound for a more pop-centric audience. There are some tracks on here that I think are instantly enjoyable, maybe even a little addictive. And even the more mediocre tracks on this record, they don't go too deep into the weeds, they don't overstay their welcome given the brevity of Green overall. And even at this album's catchiest, is any of it really as good as Buddy Holly? Not really. So, Despite its initially lukewarm reception, Weezer's 2002 record Maladroit has actually gained a bit of a cult following amongst the band's fan base. Even though Rivers on this album wasn't penning songs that were as personal or as revealing as the tracks on Pinkerton, Maladroit is a bit of a return to that heavier, nastier, edgier sound the band forged on that record. The unsurpassed heaviness from Weezer on this record is enough to place it higher than Green in this ranking. And the fact that this record was so successful with its placement in the charts, it sort of showed that Weezer didn't necessarily need to tone down their sound to see success. Unfortunately, not every bad habit is broken on Maladroit. One of the lead singles, Dope Nose, is just as hard to stomach and just as vapid lyrically as Hash Pipe. And just like on Green, there are a handful of tracks on here that are pretty forgettable and breezy. The heavier production and guitars can really only do so much to mask that. Still though, there are some great highlights like the crushing opening track, the seemingly post-rock inspired Death and Destruction. Even though Maladroit is not a super substantive record from Weezer, and a lot of the tracks on this thing really deliver just simply an instantaneous thrill, this is definitely a small return to form from the band at this point in their career, and unfortunately they didn't continue to improve on or work with this sound onto their next record, Make Believe. Maybe Maladroit would be looked on more positively in retrospect if the band had sort of built up the momentum they created here. The next release in this Weezer worst to best is their 2014 record, Everything Will Be Alright in the End, which in my opinion is a really enjoyable bounce back from a few of the most disliked albums in the band's discography, HURLEY and RATITUDE. As I said earlier in this video, to me HURLEY was the band kind of going back to basics, embracing what put them on the map in the first place, just dishing out good pop rock songs, and Everything Will Be Alright in the End is just another helping of that. The chunky guitars, the youthful energy, the very hooky choruses, they're all here on this record. Weezer essentially sounding like their old selves on an amazing opener, Ain't Got Nobody. Plus, it's interesting to hear the band go down memory lane at a point in their career where they can kind of recall their career before this point, like on the track Back to the Shack. Keep in mind, at this point in the band's career, this is kind of a recurring theme that they've been touching down on one album after another. On Hurley, they were just talking about it on Memories. Take me back, back to the shack, back to the strat with the lightning strap. Kicking the door, more hardcore, rocking out like it's 94. This track is like an amazing anthemic demand for Weezer to retake the mantle that they once held. And simultaneously on this record, there is acknowledgement that things have changed and are most likely not going back to the way that they used to be on Eulogy for a Rock Band. Personally, I think Weezer are really in their element on this album. They're not laying the sugar on too heavy. They're not desperate to appeal to a crowd of people who never really messed with their music in the first place. They're also dishing out some of their best and most unique songwriting in years. Cleopatra, whose hook has a really strange groove to it. There's also Da Vinci with its quirky acoustic guitar leads and quaint whistles. Also, the hook on this thing is fantastic. Da Vinci could have been you. Easily some of the cutest lyrics that have ever been laid down on a Weezer record. There's also some surprising ambition on this record too, like the Queen-inspired vocal harmonies on I've Had It Up to Here. And the closing Futurescape trilogy is one of the oddest things that Weezer has ever put on any of their records. It's like a miniature rock opera at the very end of this album. This album that I think overall is a very solid record, features some good guest songwriting, great production, and Weezer just doing what they do best. Next in my worst to best list here is Weezer's 2016 White album, which, yes, is one of the band's more recent releases, but I actually think is one of their best. I think it's the closest they've come to rekindling the pop prowess of Blue, but with some more anthemic ambitions thrown into the mix. And the many faces of Weezer that we know all too well up until this point are looking pretty crisp on this album. You have sweet and sunny tracks like the opening California Kids or Wind in a Sail. You also cannot forget the heavily Beach Boys inspired Girl We Got a Good Thing. Probably one of the brightest and most unabashedly lovey-dovey songs that Weezer has ever recorded, and it's actually pretty great. As they achieve this vibe without having to cross over entirely into super sterile, super squeaky clean territory. There are moments on this thing that are angsty and dark and utterly obsessed with the opposite sex, like Thank God for Girls. Rivers also gets personal and kind of on a power trip on King of the World, where he imagines himself as being in a position where he can just basically protect his significant other from any kind of sadness, from having to shed a tear, despite the state of the world and despite the trauma that she suffered as a kid. We also see Rivers trapped in kind of a weird Peter Pan state, delivering a good song, but still feeling the audacity to tell LA girls to act their age, even though he, at this point in the band's career, is a man who's close to pushing 50. The album ends off with a few quality low-key cuts, the forlorn Jacked Up, as well as the acoustic beach rock number Endless Bummer. This album is certainly not Weezer's most lyrically dense or substantive. Unfortunately, the band's first two records are going to forever sit in that position. But as far as albums go that are in this post-Pinkerton era where the band is more focused on straightforward pop rock, this is definitely a high point. Pinkerton, Weezer's 1996 album, is the next release in this list as we get closer and closer to the best spot, and it is often regarded by hardcore fans to be Weezer's magnum opus, nowadays, that is. But when it initially dropped, this record was met with mixed reviews, pretty widespread dislike amongst audiences, and even unhappy fans. It was considered a commercial disappointment. I think there were multiple factors playing into this, one of which may have been the band's decision to produce the album themselves. It did come out kind of rough as a result. Certainly not as clean or as catchy or as straightforward as Blue, even in Blue's most difficult moments. And you have to keep in mind, the band's success after that record was overnight, and where you go after overnight success when your discography is so short can be difficult. Going far left so suddenly may not necessarily pay off instantly. And a drop in recording quality could mean everything, especially given Blue was pretty pristine for the time that it was released. Pinkerton's mix was decidedly way more abrasive, as evidenced by tracks like Tired of Sex. The blaring feedback, the vocals, the guitars, the drums are all hot as hell. But still, grunge and various forms of metal had already introduced a lot of these sounds into the mainstream. Really, it was Rivers' TMI lyrics that were turning a lot of fans off. The record is pretty sad, it is pretty dark, it is sex-obsessed. Also features a track that finds Rivers fetishizing a letter written to him by like an 18-year-old Japanese fan. So how exactly did this album go from total dud to perceived masterpiece? I'm not entirely sure. Maybe these days we're just more open to hearing emo Harvard boys whine about the trials and tribulations of being a rock star, as well as wanting to get laid or not wanting to get laid or whatever. Because honestly, there are moments on this album where the lyrics aren't really any less cringy than they were when it was originally released. But I guess there is something scorchingly honest about the way that Rivers sings about what he does on this record. So I guess if you're looking for an album that analyzes, maybe in an unhealthy way, but still analyzes male sexual desires in current culture, this is certainly it. All the songs hit pretty hard, they each have very intense performances, and despite all the messiness and emotional insanity on this thing, the songwriting is still pretty solid. The progressions are relatively straightforward, the hooks catch pretty hard. Pinkerton may be a flawed album, but it's a record that wears those flaws as kind of a badge of honor. Because cringeworthy confessionalism and all, Pinkerton deserves its recognition as an emo and a power pop masterpiece. Okay, and here we are at the best spot in the Weezer discography list, and that is Blue. If you've been watching my reviews for years and you have seen my video talking about how I like Blue more than Pinkerton, you may have seen this coming. But yeah, Blue is amazing, and in my opinion is easily one of the best alternative rock and power pop records of the 90s, thanks to the grungy and kind of punchy production, Rivers' boyish but very well executed lead vocals, the amazing and sweet and anthemic guitar soloing, and the band's generally perfect bittersweet sound and style. I know a lot of us like to look at and argue over Weezer now versus Weezer then, but honestly, on this very album, in the track list, we see a lot of the same ideas, sounds, and themes being explored that Weezer has been kind of recycling throughout much of their career. Truth be told, the band has not changed that much. We have Rivers looking back on his past that brought him to this point before he even really had a career in music to look back on, before he was going back to the shack. He was in the garage. We have the band and Rivers showing their love of West Coast and beach culture to the point of pure absurdity on Surf Wax America. We have Rivers' difficulties tangling with relationships, even if they are familial or platonic ones, on Say It Ain't So. And Rivers is also carefree and playful and in love on Buddy Holly. And of course, having a hard time functioning when it comes to romance and women, as evidenced by the incredibly catchy but also disturbingly controlling No One Else. Even the band's love of taking ideas from vintage pop songs and filtering them in a somewhat corny fashion through this heavy, grungy alt-rock lens was well established on Holiday. Truly the most tumultuous thing about Weezer's progression past this point in their discography is just the drop in quality of their songwriting and just kind of neutering their sound. Sadly, the band is never going to come up with a better songwriting metaphor than what they did on Undone, the sweater song. But to be fair, very few 90s bands did. And it does sound cliche at this point, I know, to say something like, Weezer's early stuff is their best, their first album is the best. But Weezer is part of the reason that cliche exists. Weezer is the ultimate they used to be good band, which is partially reality, yes, but also kind of an optical illusion for anybody who's actually willing to give anything they put out post-Pinkerton a fair shake. Not to say the band didn't reach some point of perfection on this album, because they did. But Rivers Cuomo's honesty, his vulnerability, his authenticity that he showed on this record, it could have only continued to exist in obscurity, in a bubble. Which is especially true when you consider the way that he reacted to the band's sudden popularity on Pinkerton, the way that he then reacted to Pinkerton's lack of success on the band's subsequent records. And now with every new album there seems to be at least one track where he is reflecting on, you guys are telling us what you want us to do, but we want to do what we want to do. If you could use Weezer as a prime example for anything, it's definitely how fame and attention and the music industry can destroy or even poison the creative process. Because as soon as you throw somebody into the spotlight, the last thing you're going to get from them is authenticity. And it's even funnier to think how performative it is for other artists out there to try to recreate that same sense of authenticity off of a Weezer or like a Nirvana album. But that was kind of the shape of rock to come in the 2000s, as all of the emo and indie acts that hit the mainstream during that era were far more interested in relating than they were rocking out. Which is not inherently a bad thing, but I still do think it comes from a weird place to see this sea change of rock stars out there that aren't really trying to sell fans on these grand shows of excess and stardom, and are instead trying to offer listeners more of like this display of emotional credibility. So if there's truthfully anything that Weezer's early work has that their later works don't, it's that, and it's something that unfortunately is never really going to return, especially since that Weezer continues to be one of the biggest rock acts out there today. And as somebody who's enjoyed Weezer's music for a long time, I don't think this popularity shift for the band from 94 to 2000 was a complete loss. Certainly at this point, there's nothing stopping the band from writing another My Name is Jonas, but they most likely never will put out another Only in Dreams. Not just thematically speaking, but also given how patient and raw the sound of that track is too. I know I'm talking about Blue at this point more in context of everything else and even rock music at large than about the album itself, but make no mistake, I do think this record is fantastic. The production's amazing. The flow of this record is fantastic too. The songwriting is top-notch, super catchy, super enjoyable. The singing is really passionate. Every track in the track list is pretty substantive and comes through with a very focused topic. Overall, just amazing album, and really happy to put it at the top of my worst to best list here, and that has been the Weezer worst to best. Feeling like I got a weight off my shoulders now, so yeah. Transition. Have you given these albums a listen, and how would you rank them? Let me know. I want to give a quick shout out to Austin for helping me co-write this episode of Worst to Best. Over here next to my head is another video that you can check out. Hit that up, or the link to subscribe to the channel. Anthony Fantano, music, Weezer, Worst to Best, forever.